Thanks very much, Greg, and my pleasure now to welcome Martin Matthews, Chief Executive of the Ministry of Transport, the Secretary for Transport as well. He's held this position since September 2008, middle of the global financial crisis, wasn't it, pretty much? The Ministry's purpose is to ensure our transport system helps New Zealand thrive. It's a team of approximately 150 people. It spends over $4 billion per annum. It also advises on governance, funding and performance of the New Zealand Transport Agency, the Civil Aviation Authority, Maritime New Zealand and the Transport Accident Investigation Commission. Martin was previously CEO of the Ministry for Culture and Heritage, and before that he was Assistant Auditor General. It's a very diverse career. Welcome, Martin.
The challenge and the opportunity with going last is both they've covered a lot of my territory and the opportunity is to be short, so you get to ask some questions, so I'll try and keep this brief. Let me just make a couple of remarks around how we're thinking about this, and I know the Minister's outlined the package, you'll be familiar with that. I worked alongside Mike and Greg and others in bringing together the package, and a key point about that was that it was developed in partnership with the business sector, with local government, with the supply industry and so on. Because, as I think both Mike and Greg have reflected in their remarks, we're not going to get there by anyone playing on their own. This will really require a team effort. But let me just offer a couple of remarks about long-term context for electric vehicles in New Zealand, and then perhaps briefly the rationale that underpins the program that the government's outlined. Mike and Greg have both touched on the broader New Zealand emissions profile, so I'll cut across that. I won't spend any time on that because I think it's self-evident to everyone in this room. In one sense, it's a no-brainer for us to have a crack at trying to drive electric vehicle uptake in New Zealand. The other long-term context, though, that I speak to a lot of audiences around is the future of mobility and transport. If we take a really long view about what's likely to occur in mobility and transport, we are, in my view, on the cusp of a paradigm shift in mobility. And that will be the combined effect of people moving to buy their mobility as a service, along with the effect of autonomous and connected vehicles. And I know this has already been touched on earlier in the day, but let me just remark a little bit on that because, I, for one, believe these changes will challenge us all to think very differently about how the future may unfold. And to a lot of audiences, I say, I think the change will be beyond our current imagination. So the challenge for a lot of us is to actually put ourselves in a mindset that actually sees opportunities that may be very different to the ones we see today. So my belief is that future generations, my grandkids, probably won't own a car, and Mike's already outlined my foible in life is that I'm a car nut. But I believe my grandkids won't own a car, and they won't own a car because it won't make sense to own a car anymore. It's a little bit like food supply. My grandparents, my parents all grew veggies. My wife actually is a keen gardener and grows tomatoes. None of it makes economic sense anymore. The tomatoes we eat over the summer, which all come in at the same time, are the most expensive tomatoes you could possibly get. But she does it as a hobby. So future car ownership will be because people choose to do it for some weird reason, but it won't make any rational reason. People will buy their mobility as a service, just like we go to the supermarket and buy food. We have far greater choice. It's much more convenient and it's cheaper than what was available to our forebears, and that's how mobility will work. We will buy it because it's cheaper, it's more convenient, and we get more choice. And that is very significant when you set that alongside the effect of connected and autonomous vehicles. And there are lots of sceptics about how quickly that will happen, particularly with a vehicle fleet like ours of around 14 years old, although I single-handedly add a year to that with my vintage cars. But nonetheless, this will change. And the reality is it will change alongside this mobility as a service trend, because what will happen in time is that as we buy, the big car companies are already getting into bed with the mobility companies like Uber and Lyft. GM this year spent $500 million buying into Lyft, so that says something about where they see the future. So the autonomous and connected vehicles will change the fundamental way cities work, and perhaps the best illustration of that is a piece of work that the International Transport Forum did late last year, where they modelled Lisbon as a mid-sized European city. The combined effect of people buying their mobility as a service alongside the connected and autonomous vehicles had the effect in terms of the modelling in Lisbon. It reduces peak congestion by 37%, it reduces emissions by 34%, it reduced the space needed for parking by 95%. In fact, the most optimistic analysis they did said that the demand in that city that exists today could be met with a vehicle fleet 10% the size of the current fleet. 10%. Now, you might have picked up last week some announcements around the work we're doing with Auckland Council on the 30-year strategy for Auckland, and most of that got caught in a discussion around funding, as opposed to the real point was that we're trying desperately to shift the focus away from just supply-side interventions to saying, how do we think about this future and the way it may influence demand? Because actually, the modelling we've done simply by lifting vehicle occupancy from 1.4 to 1.7 adds the equivalent of something like 20% of road capacity. In Auckland, that would come at the cost of tens of billions of dollars. So we can move mobility and the choice that people make about how they travel. The prize is massive for ratepayers and taxpayers. Now, let me just connect that with the discussion around electric vehicles. The point, I suppose, is we move to a world where vehicles are connected and autonomous. We can start to rethink what an automobile is. Most of the weight and strength that's built into these vehicles that we have today is a product of the need to have them capable of being safe, because human beings make mistakes. And just like the first petrol-powered cars look like horseless carriages, I'm sure the first autonomous cars will mostly look like cars as we know them today. But future cars will look very different. They'll be lighter, and as a consequence, it will make the electric car, the electric powertrain, a much more viable option, even if we can't crack the battery technology issues. So the point, I suppose, for New Zealand is if we're going to be really optimistic around the future and see some of the opportunities coming up, thinking about both the no-brainer dimension of this from a climate change perspective and having 80 growing to 90% renewables in our electricity, alongside the changes with future of mobility, this is the future. So it makes sense for us to think about how do we start on the journey towards this. So let me just wrap up by talking a little bit about the rationale behind what the government has announced as a first step. The real focus here is to try and influence both demand side and supply side issues in New Zealand. On the demand side, the ultimate challenge is how we shift consumer preferences to choose to buy electric vehicles. So the rationale for the game plan on the demand side is to recognise that, as I think Mike mentioned, 70% of the new vehicles entering our fleet are by fleet buyers. So if we're going to make a change in New Zealand, it makes sense for us, in the first instance, to see if we can influence the fleet buyers and the choices they make. And that's why, in developing the package that's been announced, we brought industry into the process, and it's why part of the key approach that's been announced is around the procurement and giving sort of greater certainty to fleet buyers around issues like road user charges, ACC, and tax treatment, so that actually they can have greater certainty about the whole of life costs associated with these vehicles. And it's why ECA will run a range of things around better informing both the business sector and the wider community around these vehicles, so that ultimately what we get is first the fleet buyers making these decisions. Mums and dads will get to drive those vehicles as part of the fleet. They'll ultimately go home and say, actually, this is a no-brainer for us at home as well, and we'll see it flow through. And I'm sure the second-hand vehicle importers will help that. On the supply side, the challenge at the moment is that actually the fleet buyers don't have a lot of choices in New Zealand. The supply is not significant in terms of diversity. I know the MIA, David Crawford's here, have announced what the pathway looks like over the next few years, and that's very positive. But one of the things we recognise from a broader sort of strategy point of view is that actually the New Zealand market is small by global standards. If you're an OEM or distributor, the New Zealand market is probably not going to be your first target. So one of the things we have to do is use our demand influence to make it much easier on the supply side for the distributors to choose New Zealand as a market to bring their vehicles to. And that's why we're trying to bulk up procurement, get the private sector, local government and central government together and say, how do we essentially de-risk the choices for the distributors to go to their headquarters and say, actually, we've got a deal here for 1,000 vehicles. There is no risk. These vehicles are not going to sit on showroom floors. It's a done deal. And if we can make that work, maybe we will see greater diversity of choice in the New Zealand market. So the idea behind what the government's announced is to both influence the demand side and the supply side, focusing first and foremost on the fleet buyers and ultimately seeing that flow through into private choices that you and I as consumers will make. I think I should stop there so there's time for some questions, but hopefully that gives you a little bit more context for the program we've announced.